Ma chère mademoiselle, it is with deepest pride and greatest pleasure that we welcome you tonight. And now, we invite you to relax, just pull up a chair, as the dining room proudly presents your dinner.
The review for 9.2, the French Revolution. Yeah, not your dinner. Sorry, this ain't Beauty and the Beast. So, what are we going to do? We're going to talk about the French Revolution and just how crazy awful it was. They started with a king and finished with a king and had a reign of terror in between. It's kind of like a rhyme. Ha! I bet you didn't know I had that kind of time. You owe me a dime or a slice of lime. Here we go. So why were the French willing to have a revolution? Well, one reason is there was incredible inequality. Remember we talked about our three estates? The clergy, the nobility, and the AYOs, all the others, the people on the bottom of society, carrying around all the rich nobles and the church members. Boy, they don't look very happy. That's social discontent. They had all the population, not a lot of the land, and they paid all the taxes. We also had King Louis XVI, who, like his granddad, Louis XIV, was the epitome of absolutism. Not a great king, focused on things that were not nearly as important, especially wasting money at Versailles with big fancy parties, etc. Things were bad, and you have a very frustrated, discontent, angry Third Estate. So when King Louis decides to return the Estates General, kind of like the American Congress or the English starts with a P, Parliament, calls the Estates General back. He's trying to find a way to get taxes. The problem with the Estates General, if you remember, was that the clergy got a vote, the nobility got a vote, and the commoners got a vote. And the vote tended to be 2-1. And as a result of that, the Third Estate got frustrated. And they got frustrated enough that they began to call for, well, some changes, some big-time changes. About the same time, there was some really bad harvest. And because of this really bad harvest, they were lacking bread, which was frustrating people. Huge debt from war. Sorry, that's because you helped America during the war. And the problems worsen. And when the Third Estate starts to grumble too much, Louis locks them out. He kicks them out of the Estates General. So they go across the street to a big tennis court where they have the tennis court oath, basically saying, we're not leaving here till we have a new government. And they form the National Assembly. Well, Louis, of course, doesn't like that, so he starts to call in the troops, which leads to a little more frustration. The next thing you know, the National Assembly are storming the Bastille, July 14th, 1789. That's their Independence Day moment. Not really super important what happened at the Bastille. It's just the day when they fought back against the king. And very soon thereafter, they come up with the Declaration of Rights of Man. And the Declaration of the Rights of Man is almost a way of saying the old regime is gone. We're going to get rid of the king. We don't want him around. Well, King Louis is kind of getting the message, and he tries to escape to Austria. Catholic France, Catholic Austria, good place to catch up and maybe find some people to protect you. Right about this time, the women march on Paris demanding bread. And when you got a bunch of angry women, something's about to happen. And what's about to happen is say goodbye to Louis XVI's head. Yes, he and Marie Antoinette were both executed via guillotine. And when that happens, the rest of Europe gets pretty scared, and all those European kings decide, you know what? We don't want our people to think they can cut our heads off and have their own revolution. So let's try and find a way where we can maybe invade France and put a king back on the throne. In the meantime, in France, if you don't have a king, what do you have? Well, they decided to have a national convention. And the National Convention was the name of their new government. The Girondists were the group of people mostly in charge of this, whereas the Jacobins were pushing for more radical ideas. But the National Convention is too weak, kind of like the Articles of Confederation in America, which leads this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, to take over as part of the Committee of Public Safety, which is the exact opposite when you start chopping people's heads off. As you can see, the French Revolution gets a little bloody, a little crazy. I don't know about you, but that's not the kind of parade we see at homecoming. And as a result, they called this time period the Reign of Terror. And during the Reign of Terror, many, many people were executed, whether you were too much of a royalist or too much of a Jacobin or somewhere in between. It got crazy enough that at the end of the Reign of Terror, guess who got his head cut off? Yep, Maximilien Robespierre. 16,000 guillotined in the Reign of Terror. So now it's time to talk about this guy, Napoleon. After the Reign of Terror, the Directory took over, which was, again, pretty weak. And so it doesn't take long for the rock star general named Napoleon, who had been winning battles left and right all around Europe, keeping those European nations from invading and conquering France, trying to put a king back on the throne. And Napoleon was able to prevent many of these conquests, and so they saw him as like a Julius Caesar. Man, he's our dude. And so finally he overthrows the Directory in a coup d'etat, October of 1795 to November of 1790, and now he considers himself the consulate in charge. So kind of like the first triumvirate in Rome. Now Napoleon wasn't all bad. He was able to clean up France and many of the cities by imposing some harsh, important street sanitation, rebuilding. He also wrote down a civil code called the Napoleonic Code, in which he was able to get all of the laws written for the people. He also made civil service mandatory as opposed to just handing out the jobs to whatever had the richest daddy. And it's soon thereafter that Napoleon becomes Emperor Napoleon. Again, he's winning battles, expanding territory, taking land, becoming so powerful that he's able to take the crown right out of the Pope's hand and put it on his own head to crown himself the Holy Roman Emperor in 1804. But Napoleon wasn't perfect, and he had his mistakes. His mistakes included the continental system, in which he basically told everybody in Europe, you're not allowed to play with England anymore, because England, of course, is France's enemy. And so when Napoleon told everybody in Europe, you're not allowed to trade with England anymore, well, some listened because they didn't want to get spanked by Napoleon, but Russia didn't. And so Napoleon decides to teach Russia a lesson. And he invades Russia with 600,000 men. And between scorched earth, winter, and some pretty tough Russian soldiers, they spank Napoleon. And he leaves with less than 100,000 men. This is where Tchaikovsky wrote his 1812 overture, the greatest pep rally, we kicked your butt song ever written. And so Napoleon slinks out of Russia with very few men, and in 1814, he's defeated by the coalition of troops and exiled to Elba, where he has to be imprisoned on an island in the Mediterranean. Well, he's not there super long when he decides to escape, and he goes back to France, who meanwhile had put Louis XVIII, the brother of Louis XVI, on the throne. And his return, referred to as the 100 Days, is a triumphant, amazing. The people of France rally behind Napoleon because they remember how cool France was when Napoleon was in charge. Louis XVIII runs away in terror. And in March 1815, he is back on the throne, baby. Well, Europe can't have that. And so they get the coalition back together, and they said, Lord Wellington, the general who has studied Napoleon more than any other, and the British General Wellington defeats Napoleon at Waterloo, and Napoleon is imprisoned again, where he basically just slides off into obscurity. In the meantime, France is like, well, who's in charge of us? Oh, yeah, we'll put Louis XVIII back on the throne. So for those of you keeping score at home, it was king, bunch of stuff, chop some heads, reign of terror, bunch of stuff, Napoleon, king, Napoleon, king. Pretty crazy, but that's the French Revolution. Oui, oui.